A billionaire stood in her driveway, arms crossed, laughing at her neighbor. "You spent $100 on that?" The rusted heap sat there like a bad joke. Neighbors whispered. The 7-year-old boy stared at his shoes, cheeks burning. Logan Mercer didn't flinch, because he'd seen something nobody else had. Something buried under 50 years of rust, shame, and silence. What happened next would shake the entire vintage racing world and expose a 50-year-old lie that's destroyed an innocent man's life. If you're new here, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The salvage yard smelled the way they all do: motor oil, baked into cracked asphalt, rubber gone soft in the heat, and underneath it all, something older. Something metallic and forgotten, like the inside of a drawer nobody had opened in 30 years. Logan Mercer walked the rows slowly. He always walked slowly. His buddy Darnell used to joke about it back in high school, said Logan moved through junkyards, like other people moved through museums. Head tilted just slightly, eyes sliding across surfaces, hands resting at his sides, not reaching, not touching, just reading. It was a Saturday in October, cold enough that his breath came out in thin wisps. Owen was at his grandmother's for the weekend, which meant Logan had 6 hours where nobody needed anything from him. 6 hours where he didn't have to be anybody's dad, anybody's employee, anybody's neighbor, just himself. He'd started coming to Hendrick's Salvage on days like this about 4 years ago after Karen died. He didn't have money to spend, still didn't, really, but there was something about walking these rows that settled him down in a way nothing else did. The cars didn't ask him how he was holding up. They didn't look at him with that soft, careful sympathy that made him want to disappear into the floor. They were just there, broken and honest. He was about halfway down the 3rd row when he saw it. Most people would have walked right past it. Most people had walked right past it. Clearly the thing was shoved between a crushed minivan and a rusted-out pickup truck, half hidden under a torn tarp that had long since given up doing its job. What peeked out from underneath was brown with oxidation, dented in 3 separate places along the passenger door, and missing both headlights. The windshield had a crack running corner to corner like a bad signature. Logan stopped. He didn't know why exactly, not yet. It was more of a feeling, the same feeling he got sometimes when he was sorting through old hardware at work, and his would close around a bolt that seemed too precisely machined to be anything ordinary. Your hands knew things before your brain caught up. He lifted the tarp. The proportions hit him first. The rust, not the damage. The shape underneath all of it, the way the body sat low and wide, the way the roofline curved back with this particular authority that mass-produced cars simply didn't have. This wasn't a mold thing. Somebody had shaped this metal by hand, panel by panel with hammers and dollies, and a level of patience that was almost painful to think about. He crouched down and looked at the sill line. Even under 30, maybe 40 years of corrosion, he could see the slight variations in the metal surface that came from hand shaping. Machine-stamped panels were too consistent. This was different. This had been made by a human being who knew exactly what they were doing. He walked around the back. The chassis geometry he could see through the rusted undercarriage was not standard, even close. Logan stood up slowly. "Hey!" He called over toward the front office where old Pete Hendricks was drinking coffee and pretending to do paperwork. "Pete, what's the story on this one?" Pete didn't even look up. "Which one?" "The coupe, 3rd row, buried under the blue tarp." A pause. The sound of a coffee mug being set down. "Had it about 2 years, Pete said. Came off an estate sale up in Carver County. Old farmhouse, they were clearing everything out. Nobody knows what it is. Couldn't get a plate number off it. VIN's been ground down on the firewall. I checked. Title's a mess." He finally looked up. "I'll take $100 for it just to get it out of here." Logan looked at the car. $100 was 2 weeks of Owen's lunch money. It was the copay he'd been putting off for his own dentist appointment. It was 30 miles of gasoline and the new work gloves he'd been meaning to buy for 6 weeks. "Done," he said. He had it towed home that afternoon. Yes, he'd intervened. He lived in a modest neighborhood, the kind where houses were built sometime in the 1970s and had been passed through 3 or 4 families since, each one leaving their mark in small ways. Storm doors that didn't quite match. Driveways that had been repaved in sections, never all at once. Logan's garage was detached, slightly leaning on the left side, with a workbench along the entire back wall that he'd built himself over 2 weekends when Owen was 4. The flatbed driver dropped the coupe in the driveway while Logan signed the paperwork. He heard the screen door next door open. He didn't have to look. He already knew the sound of Sienna Whitmore's heels on her porch steps. She'd moved in 14 months ago, which still surprised him whenever he thought about it. This neighborhood was not where people like Sienna Whitmore lived. She was 30 years old and had founded a logistics technology company at 24 that she'd sold 3 years later for enough money that the local business journal had run a full feature on her. She'd bought the house next door, almost as an afterthought, apparently something about wanting to be closer to her mother, who lived 20 minutes away. She worked remotely now, building her second company. She drove a car that cost more than Logan would earn in 4 years. They had what Logan would generously describe as a polite, cautious relationship. She was perfectly civil. He was perfectly civil. They waved. They made brief, careful small talk about the weather when the garbage cans brought them to the edge of their respective driveways. Yet he'd intervened. Once, she'd brought over a bottle of wine after it had been a kind gesture, that he'd appreciated without knowing quite what to do with. He didn't dislike her. He didn't really know her. But she was looking at the car on his driveway now, and her face was doing something he recognized, that particular kind of expression, where someone is trying very hard not to visibly react, but isn't quite managing it. "Project?" she asked. "Might be," Logan said, pulling his work gloves from his back pocket. She came down the 2 steps from her porch and crossed to the property line, which was marked by a strip of slightly different colored grass. Her coat was cashmere. He didn't know much about cashmere, but he knew enough to recognize it. She said his name with this very careful, measured quality. Did you buy that?" "Just now." She was quiet for a moment. "What is it?" "Not sure yet." She looked at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they're joking. He was not joking, and she could tell, which seemed to make it worse. "How much did you—" She stopped herself. Then, apparently deciding the situation warranted directness. "How much did you pay for it?" $100. The pause that followed was about 4 seconds long. He counted. "You paid," she said slowly, $100. "For that?" "Yep." The screen door behind him banged open, and Owen came tumbling out of the house he'd gotten dropped off early from his grandmother's. He apparently wearing his soccer cleats still for some reason. And a sweatshirt that was on backwards. 7 years old and completely indifferent to the concept of appropriate clothing. "Dad, what is that?" He thundered down the porch steps and stopped dead on the driveway, staring at the coupe with the same wide, uncomplicated amazement that only kids could pull off. Logan felt a small warmth move through his chest. "That," he said, "is a project. It looks like it's been in a war," Owen said. "Several, maybe." Owen walked around the front of the car with his hands clasped behind his back in a pose Logan recognized as an unconscious imitation of himself. "Can we fix it?" "We're going to try." Sienna was still standing at the property line. He could feel her watching them, though he wasn't looking at her. Her voice was friendly, the way she always was with his son, whatever reservations she had about Logan's decisions. She'd never once directed any of it at the kid, which Logan respected. "Do you think it's a good idea for your dad to spend money on something like this?" Looked at the car, then at Logan, then back at Sienna. "My dad knows about cars," Owen said, with the quiet certainty of a child who has never once doubted his competence in this particular domain. "It's about everything in the garage." Sienna looked at Logan with an expression he couldn't quite parse. "I'm sure he does," she said, and went back inside. Owen fell asleep on the couch at 8:30, still in the backwards sweatshirt. Logan worked until 2 in the morning. He started at the engine bay because that was where identities usually hid. Stamped numbers on blocks, manufacturer markings on components. Things that survived even when the body was gone to rust, and the interior had been stripped. He worked by the light of 2 shop lamps, hung from the rafters, moving slowly, methodically, the way his father had taught him, clean as you go. Look before you touch, and never assume you know what something is before you've actually looked at it. The first thing he noticed was the engine itself. It was not a production engine. He was certain of that within about 20 minutes of examination. The castings were different, more precise, with a kind of deliberate weight distribution that was completely inconsistent with anything he recognized from standard manufacturers of the era. This had been built for a specific purpose. The cooling passages were too sophisticated, the porting work too deliberate. He sat back on his heels and breathed through his nose for a moment. So it's not a stock build. It's a one-off or close to it. He moved to the firewall. The VIN had been ground down, like Pete said. Whoever had done it hadn't known or hadn't cared that the firewall on certain hand-built cars from the 60s and 70s sometimes carried secondary identification markings stamped into the metal during fabrication. A serial number. More like a builder's mark. The kind of thing that only meant something to the people who put it there. Logan had seen exactly this once before, on a car he'd helped restore 8 years ago for a collector up in the city. A small stamped series of letters and numbers, almost like a craftsman's signature, pressed into the metal itself. He got his light close to the firewall and started cleaning. It took 40 minutes of careful work with a wire brush and a can of penetrating oil before he could see it clearly. 3 characters, then a dash, then a number, AV3. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went inside, opened his laptop at the kitchen table, and started searching. Arthur Vale was not a famous man, was the first thing Logan learned. And, in some ways, it was the saddest thing. He'd been an engineer, a genuine one, trained formally, who'd spent most of the 1960s working with various semi-professional and amateur racing programs around the Midwest before landing a position with a small, privately funded endurance racing operation called Creston Motorsport in 1968. The operation was funded by a wealthy industrialist named Henry Creston, who had money and very little patience for the incremental approach that dominated American racing engineering at the time. He wanted Vale to build something new. What Vale designed over the next 4 years were 3 experimental endurance prototypes hand-fabricated, one at a time, each one incorporating lessons learned from the previous build. They were called, with characteristic engineering directness, Prototype 1, Prototype 2, and Prototype 3. They were never given names. Arthur Vale, apparently, had not been a sentimental man about that kind of thing. The program ran from 1969 through 1972. Then, everything collapsed. Logan found the details scattered across 3 different sources: an archived racing journal from 1973, a brief mention in an out-of-print book about Midwestern racing history that someone had partially scanned and uploaded in pieces, and a forum post from 11 years ago by a user who claimed to be a nephew of one of Vale's original mechanics. During a testing session in the spring of 1972, the driver of Prototype 2, a man named Raymond Colt, who was 29 years old, had lost control on a high-speed section and suffered fatal injuries. The accident investigation that followed was, by the accounts Logan could find, complicated, inconclusive, and brutal for Arthur Vale personally. The program was shut down. Creston withdrew his funding. The 3 cars were supposed to be destroyed. After that, Arthur Vale essentially disappeared from the historical record. Subsequent engineering credits. No further competition involvement. A single brief mention in a 1981 regional newspaper noting that he'd taken a job teaching shop classes at a community college in rural Indiana. And then, nothing. The racing world, which had barely noticed him when he was building something remarkable, didn't notice at all when he stopped. Logan scrolled back up to the top of his search results. AV3, Arthur Vale. Prototype 3, the one that was supposed to have been destroyed 50 years ago, was sitting in his garage under 2 shop lights with leaves from last autumn still tucked into the wheel wells. Logan pressed his palms flat against the kitchen table and looked at his hands. For a moment. They were still dirty from the garage. There was penetrating oil under 2 of his fingernails. He thought about a man spending his life believing his finest work had been erased. Then he got up, made himself a cup of coffee, and went back out to the garage to keep looking. He told no one for 4 days. This was not a strategy. He was not playing it carefully. He simply needed to be certain before he said anything out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that couldn't be unmade, and he had learned the hard way, and more than once, that not every feeling of certainty held up, exposed to daylight. He spent those 4 evenings doing exactly what he did for a living, which was look at mechanical things with patience and honesty. He documented everything with his phone camera. He measured what he could measure. He cross-referenced what he found against the partial documentation he could pull together from his research dimensions, component types, the specific welding techniques visible on the chassis joints that matched descriptions in the archived racing journal. On the fourth night, he sat on an overturned milk crate in the garage, with his coffee going cold beside him, and looked at the car for a long time without doing anything else. He was certain. The next morning, he called in a favor from a man named Gerald Hatch, who was 63 years old, retired, had spent 35 years as an automotive historian with an organization that authenticated vintage vehicles for auction houses and museums. Logan had met him 2 years ago when a collector hired him to help with a restoration, and they'd stayed in occasional contact since. Gerald was meticulous, blunt, and completely immune to wishful thinking, which was exactly what Logan needed. He sent Gerald 67 photographs. Then he waited. Gerald called back in 4 hours. Logan, his voice was doing something unusual. Logan had spoken with Gerald maybe a dozen times and had never heard him sound like this, compressed, controlled. The way someone sounds when they are working very hard at being calm. "Where did you get this car?" "Salvage yard." "Why?" "Because," Gerald said carefully, "if what I'm looking at is what I think I'm looking at." He stopped. Started again. "I need to come see it in person. Next week." "Can you make that work?" "Yeah," Logan said. "I can make that work. Move it. Don't clean anything else. Don't let anyone else photograph it. Just promise me." "I promise." There was a silence. Gerald said, "I've been doing this for 35 years. I have authenticated 2 lost Ferraris, a Bugatti that was thought to have been melted down in the war, and a Ford GT prototype that the company itself had written off as destroyed." Another pause. "I've never said this to anyone, but I need you to understand what I might be looking at. If this is what I think it is, you need to be very, very careful about who you tell and what you do next." Logan looked at the car. "I'll be careful," he said. Gerald came on a Tuesday and spent 6 hours in the garage without sitting down once. He brought his own lights and his own tools, and a leather notebook that he filled with careful small handwriting. He spoke very little. Logan made coffee and stayed out of his way and watched Owen do homework at the workbench. The kid completely unbothered by the presence of a stranger examining a rusted car with the intensity of a surgeon. At 5 in the afternoon, Gerald closed his notebook. "It's real," he said. "Vale Prototype 3. I'm confident enough to put my name on it formally." The garage was very quiet. Owen looked up from his homework. "Dad, what does that mean?" Logan was looking at Gerald. "What's it worth?" he asked. Gerald took his glasses off and cleaned them with a cloth from his shirt pocket. This, Logan had noticed, was what he did when he was about to say something that needed a moment to land properly. At auction, Gerald said, with proper authentication and provenance documentation, given the historical significance and the fact that it's the only known complete survivor. He put his glasses back on. "Conservative estimate, $4 to $7 million. Owen's pencil hit the workbench. "Dad." Logan said nothing. Gerald was watching him, with an expression that was careful and curious and slightly unreadable. It was significant," he said. "Not a question." "I knew it was something," Logan said. "Didn't know what exactly." "You do." Gerald paused. "What are you going to do?" Logan looked at the car. The rust, the damage, the dents along the passenger door, the cracked windshield with the bad signature, crack running corner to corner. Underneath all of that, proportions so precise a man had made them by hand. One careful blow at a time. "No yet," Logan said. But he did know. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud. The photographs went online 3 days later. Because Logan posted them, he had not decided to post them. In a 7-year-old's complete absence of guile, had taken Logan's phone while he was in the shower Saturday morning, found the photographs, and sent them to Logan's oldest friend Marcus Webb with the message, "Dad found something cool. Can you believe this?" Marcus, who was 34, worked in IT, and had absolutely no filter whatsoever, had posted them to a vintage racing enthusiast forum at 9 in the morning with the caption, "My buddy bought this for 100. Anybody know what it is?" By noon, the thread had 400 responses. By evening, Gerald was calling Logan with the tone of a man who was simultaneously horrified and trying not to be. "It's out," Gerald said. "I know," Logan said. He was standing in the kitchen, still in his work clothes from the hardware store, reading the thread on his laptop. The responses ranged from skeptical to ecstatic to one man who appeared to have written a 2,000-word essay from his phone about the historical importance of Vale's engineering philosophy. "Logan, I know, Gerald, you're going to have people contacting you." A pause. "How's Owen?" Gerald asked. "He's grounded," Logan said. Owen, from the living room. "That's not fair. I was excited." "Grounded," Logan said again, louder. Gerald made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The phone calls started the next morning. The first collector offered $60,000 before Gerald had even finished the formal authentication paperwork. Logan thanked him and said he wasn't selling. The man called back 2 days later with $90,000. Logan thanked him again and said the same thing. Then Victor Langford called. Logan didn't know who Victor Langford was at first, which probably said more about the difference in their respective worlds than anything else. Langford was in his early 60s, self-made, and had spent the last 20 years building what was described, by people who'd seen it, as one of the most significant private automotive collections in North America. He had a compound in Connecticut. He had 2 full-time restoration specialists on staff. He had the polished, unhurried manner of a man who had not been told no very often, and found the experience genuinely interesting when it happened. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not interested in games. I know you've been approached by several people already. The authentication is essentially complete. That you're a single father who works at a hardware store and has been carrying debt since your wife passed." Logan was standing in his driveway when he took the call. It was raining slightly. "How do you know that?" he said. "I'm thorough," Langford said, simply without apology. "I'm not saying that to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because I want to be honest with you about what I know, which is that I can end your financial problems this week. I can give your son the stability you've been working toward. I'm prepared to offer $2 million. The rain was coming down a little harder. "That's a lot of money," Logan said. "It is," Langford agreed, "and I recognize that this car means something to you. I'm not dismissing that, but I can offer that car a home where it will be properly preserved, properly protected, and appreciated by someone who understands exactly what it represents." Logan looked at his house, the storm door that didn't quite close all the way, the porch steps with the loose board he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months. "I'll think about it," he said. He could hear, in the silence on the other end of the line, that Victor Langford was not accustomed to that particular answer. "Of course," Langford said pleasantly. "I'll be in touch." The call from Arthur Vale's daughter came 2 days after that. Her name was Eleanor Vale Greer. She was 61 years old. She had a voice that was steady and warm and careful, in the way that voices get when someone has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She explained that she'd seen the online forum post through a friend who followed vintage racing. She'd spent 3 days working up the courage to call the number she'd found through 3 separate people.
Yep.
"I want to be very clear about something first," she said, calling to make any claim. "That car is yours. You bought it, you found it, and whatever you decide to do with it is completely your right. No, I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything, really." Logan was sitting at the kitchen table. Owen was at school. "What are you asking for?" he said, a pause. "My father died in 2003, Eleanor said. He spent the last 30 years of his life teaching shop classes at a community college. He was a good teacher. His students liked him. But she stopped. He built 3 cars that he believed were the best engineering work of his life, and he spent the rest of that life believing that all beans been destroyed, that the accident that everything he'd made was just gone. I just want you to know who made that car. That's all. I just wanted whoever found it to know." Logan looked at the window. Outside, a couple of crows were sitting keen on the power line. One of them was watching the garage. "Mrs. Vale Greer," he said. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor." He paused. "I've spent the last 2 weeks reading everything I could find about your father's engineering work. And I want you to know," he stopped. Started again. "The car is extraordinary. What he made is genuinely extraordinary." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had changed slightly, not breaking, but something shifting beneath it. I haven't decided what to do with it yet, Logan said. Whatever I decide, I want his name attached to it. Properly. That's not something I'm willing to negotiate. Silences. You're not going to sell it to the private collector, are you? Eleanor said. Quite a question. Logan thought about Victor Langford's smooth, careful voice. I can end your financial problems this week. No, he said. I don't think I am. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. I need a favor, he said. Marcus said, I'm so sorry about the photos. I told Owen about that. I need you to help me set up a crowdfunding page. A pause. For what? Logan looked toward the garage door. For the restoration, he said. He didn't expect it to go anywhere. He built the page himself over a weekend with Marcus's help, straightforward, no frills, honest about who he was and what he was trying to do and what it would cost. Explained the history, explained the significance, explained that he'd been offered money to sell it into a private collection and had turned it down. He said that if the project raised enough to get started, he'd figure out the rest. He set the initial goal at $40,000 to buy basic materials and get proper structural assessments done. The page raised $63,000 in the first 11 days. Logan sat with the laptop at his kitchen table one evening, looking at the number, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not relief, not excitement exactly. More like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known was there. Owen came and looked over his shoulder. Dad, he said, there are comments from people in like 15 countries. I see that. There's one from Japan. Owen pointed at the screen. It says, I can't read that part, but it says your name after. Logan looked at the comment. He couldn't read it either. We'll figure out what it says, he said. Owen leaned against his arm. Are we actually going to fix it? Logan thought about Eleanor Vale Greer's voice on the phone, the steadiness of it, and what was underneath the steadiness. Yeah, he said. We're going to fix it. Outside, the wind picked up and moved through the maple tree in the front yard, and the leaves came down in the porch light in a slow, scattered way, and the garage sat quiet and dark at the end of the driveway with something extraordinary inside it, waiting. The crowdfunding page changed things in ways Logan hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely prepared for. It wasn't just the money, though. $63,000 in 11 days was more than he'd earned in the previous 14 months combined, and the number had kept climbing past that in the days after. It was the attention that came with it, the emails, the messages, the phone calls from people he'd never heard of who had somehow found his personal Zinsel number and felt completely comfortable using it at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday. A vintage racing magazine reached out wanting an exclusive story. 2 separate podcast hosts wanted interviews. A documentary filmmaker from Chicago left a voicemail that was 4 minutes long and included at one point the phrase generational significance, which Logan had listened to 3 times with an expression on his face that Owen described as like when you smell something weird but you're not sure where it's coming from. Logan handled most of it by not handling it at all, which was not a strategy so much as a consequence of working 40 hours a week at the hardware store, raising a 7-year-old, and spending his evenings doing preliminary disassembly on a 50-year-old racing prototype in a garage that was slightly too cold and not quite large enough for what the project was becoming. Marcus helped when he could. Gerald Hatch sent emails with advice and contacts, and the occasional stern warning about which journalists to avoid. For his part, had appointed himself unofficial documentarian of the project with Logan's old point-and-shoot camera, and had amassed approximately 400 photographs of various corroded components, most of them slightly out of focus. It was Sienna who showed up on a Thursday evening with a legal pad and a very direct question. Logan was under the car when he heard her knock on the garage door frame. He slid out on the creeper, looked up at her, and registered that she was not wearing cashmere, this time just jeans and a plain dark sweater, hair pulled back, no jewelry except small gold studs in her ears. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who was not trying to look like anything in particular. She also looked slightly nervous, which he'd never seen before, and wasn't sure what to do with. Can I come in? She said. You're already in, he said. He sat up and pulled the shop rag from his back pocket. She looked around the garage with careful attention of someone taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the disassembled components laid out on the workbench, the labeled bags of fasteners. The photography setup Owen had rigged from a clamp light and a piece of white cardboard. "I owe you an apology," she said. Logan wiped his hands. "You don't have to." She said it firmly, not aggressively, the way you'd correct a misunderstanding. "I stood in your driveway and questioned your judgment in front of your son. Was condescending, and I'm sorry." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "I thought you'd made a foolish financial decision," she continued, "because the car looked worthless, and the money was obviously—" She paused. "I made a lot of assumptions about what you could afford to spend and what your priorities should be. And I was wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong about the money," Logan said. "It was a stretch. But you were right about the car." A silence. She looked at the coupe, or what was currently visible of it, which was the chassis and engine bay, the body panels having been carefully removed and stored along the right-hand wall. "I've been reading about Arthur Vale," she said. That surprised him. He hadn't expected that. "Gerald sent me some of the documentation," she said, anticipating the question. "He thought I might be useful. I think he was trying to be diplomatic about the fact that your project management approach is—" She stopped. "Is what?" "Generous," she said carefully, "and not particularly scalable." Logan almost smiled. "You could just say it's a mess." "It's not a mess. It's just," she glanced at the legal pad in her hand, "have $68,000 in crowdfunding commitments, no formal budget, no contractor agreements, no project timeline, no media strategy, and 3 journalists who have already published inaccurate information about the car's estimated value because nobody responded to their requests for comment." Logan stared at her. "I've been busy," he said. "I know you've been busy. That's why I'm here." She held up the legal pad. "I built my first company's operational framework in a studio apartment in 4 days. I can help you build this, if you want. No obligation." He looked at the legal pad. She'd already filled 3 pages. "Why?" he said, sighing. She seemed slightly thrown by the directness of the question. "Why what? Why do you want to help? You don't have any stake in this." She was quiet for a moment, and he got the sense she was deciding whether to give him the practical answer or the real one. "Because I've watched you work out here every night for 3 weeks," she said finally, "and because I know what it looks like when someone is doing the right thing the hard way, and I have skills that could make it less hard." She paused. "Because I said something dismissive in front of your kid, and I'd like to do something better than just apologize for it." The garage was quiet, except for the sound of the space heater in the corner. "All right," Logan said. "All right, you'll think about it." Or "All right, yes." "Right, yes." She nodded once, the way you do when a business meeting has concluded productively. Then she looked around the garage again, and something softened slightly in her expression, not performed, just there. "Took a picture of me the other day," she said, "through the fence. I didn't notice until he waved." "He's photographing everything related to the project," Logan said. "You're adjacent to the project." "I'll take it," she said, almost smiled. Within 2 weeks, Sienna had restructured the crowdfunding campaign with clearer documentation, set up a dedicated email address with managed responses, drafted contractor agreements for the restoration specialist who'd begun volunteering their time, and negotiated a formal arrangement with Gerald Hatch that formalized his consulting role and protected everyone involved. She did all of this from her home office next door, sending Logan organized summaries each evening that he read at the kitchen table while Owen did homework across from him. He did not always understand every element of what she'd written. Some of it was legally dense in ways that made his head swim. But he understood the shape of it, and the shape was solid. "She's really good at this stuff," Marcus observed. One Saturday morning, when he and Logan were working on removing the engine for inspection, he said it with the careful neutrality of someone who wants to make a point without appearing to make it. "She is," Logan agreed, not looking up from what he was doing. "She's also like objectively, Marcus. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Hand me the extension." Marcus handed him the extension. She came over and brought Owen a book about engineering history. Logan paused. He said, "Yeah, she knocked on the door when you were at work." He apparently talked her ear off about the project for 40 minutes, and she just sat there and listened. Marcus kept his voice carefully neutral. She brought sticky notes, so he could mark the pages he wanted to read to you. Logan didn't say anything for a moment. He kept working. She's a neighbor helping with a project, he said. Sure, Marcus said. That's it. Absolutely, Marcus said, in the tone of someone who completely disagrees and is choosing not to say so. Logan decided to ignore all of it. Victor Langford called again, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Logan was on his lunch break at the hardware store, eating a sandwich in the back room. The offer had gone up. $3.2 million, Langford said. Smooth as always, unhurried, like he was discussing a restaurant reservation. That's my current position, Mr. Mercer. I've seen the crowdfunding numbers. The public attention has been significant. I'm accounting for that. Logan swallowed a bite of his sandwich and looked at the wall. $3.2 million. He'd tried, in idle moments over the past weeks, to actually conceptualize what that number meant in terms of his life. The debt that would disappear. The house that could be repaired properly. Owen's college fund, fully stocked, not touched. The hardware store shifts that could stop. The nights when he lay awake calculating how much further a paycheck needed to stretch just to make the numbers behave. I appreciate the offer, Logan said. I sense a but, Langford said. I made a commitment to Eleanor Vale Greer that her father's name would be publicly attached to this car. A private collection is still a collection, Langford said. I invite scholars, historians, journalists. The car would be accessible to people who get an invitation from Victor Langford, Logan said. That's not the same thing as public. A pause. The first one Logan had noticed from Langford that felt genuine rather than strategic. Most people in your position, Langford said carefully, have taken the first offer. Most people weren't looking at this car the way I was, Logan said. Their pause. I'll leave the offer open, Langford said. I think you'll find as the costs of this project become clearer that the mathematics of idealism become more complicated. After he hung up, Logan sat with the rest of his sandwich for a few minutes. He wasn't hungry anymore. The mathematics of idealism. He turned the phrase over in his mind. He thought about the figure on the crowdfunding page. He thought about the restoration specialists he'd spoken with, good people, experienced people who told him honestly that the structural damage they were anticipating on the chassis would push costs into territory that current funding didn't come close to covering. He thought about the insurance situation, which Sienna had flagged as critical and unresolved. He thought about his mortgage and Owen's shoes that were getting too small and the space heater in the garage that was cycling on and off in a way that was going to become a problem before winter was done. He thought about Eleanor Vale Greer saying, I just want you to know who made that car. He went back to work. A structural assessment happened on a Saturday, with two specialists Sienna had vetted through Gerald's network. They were a man named Dwight and a woman named Carol, who had between them 60 years of experience with vintage vehicle restoration and communicated primarily through a rapid shorthand of technical terminology and facial expressions that Logan could partially follow and partly just felt. They worked for 3 hours. Logan stayed nearby, but out of the way, the way he'd learned to do. Owen came out at one point with the camera and was permitted to take 3 photographs before Dwight politely but firmly suggested he give them some space. When Dwight and Carol were done, they sat on the workbench and told Logan what they'd found. The news was not catastrophic. It was, however, expensive. The chassis had fatigue damage along 2 critical sections, not surprising for a car that had been sitting in unknown conditions for decades, and the repair process would require custom fabrication work using period-correct methods if the structural integrity was going to be restored properly, rather than just cosmetically. There was also rust penetration in the lower body structure that was worse than it had appeared, and several of the suspension components were beyond saving and would require reproduction parts made to the original specifications. What are we talking total? Logan asked. Dwight and Carol exchanged a look. Honestly, Carol said, if you want it done right, and by right I mean reversible, documented, period correct, the kind of restoration that holds up to scrutiny from a museum standpoint. She paused, probably looking at the better part of $200,000. Maybe more, depending on what we find once we get further into the chassis. The garage was quiet. The crowdfunding is at $87,000, Logan said, because they didn't know this, just because he needed to say it out loud. Yeah, Dwight said. Owen appeared in the garage doorway, camera around his neck, reading the room with the particular sensitivity of a kid who'd grown up paying close attention to the adults around him. Is it bad, he said. It's a big number, Logan said. We're still doing it? Logan looked at the chassis. The 2 sections of fatigue damage were marked with Carroll's blue painter's tape, 2 strips of ordinary blue tape, indicating the places where something extraordinary had been pushed past Hammett's limit by time and gravity and neglect. He said, we're still doing it. Sienna heard the number that evening. She came over after dinner, which had become a kind of informal routine over the preceding weeks, not planned, not discussed, just a pattern that had established itself the way small patterns do, through repetition and the gradual erosion of whatever hesitation had existed at the beginning. Logan would be in the garage or at the kitchen table. Owen would be winding down toward bed. She'd knock, Logan would call her in, and they'd work through whatever needed working through. This time she sat across from him at the kitchen table with the structural assessment report in front of her and read it twice without saying anything. The gap is about 115,000 at minimum, she said finally. Give or take. She made a note on her legal pad. The campaign has momentum. We can push it. There's a feature coming out in a restoration-focused publication next month that Gerald helped arrange. And that should drive another wave. How much of a wave? Uncertain. Could be 20,000. Could be more. She tapped her pen against the pad. We need another strategy running in parallel. Have you thought about the media approach? I've been avoiding it. I know you have. She said it without judgment. But there's a version of this where the story itself raises the money. A press release, an actual story. The car veils history, what the project is trying to do. The right journalist with the right platform. She looked up at him. People respond to this, not just car enthusiasts. People respond to a man who turned down $3 million to do the right thing. 3.2, Logan said. She blinked. He went up again? Today, for just a moment, she dropped the organized, practical manner that was her default mode in these conversations, and he caught a glimpse of something more direct underneath it. Logan, she said, are you okay with the pressure of this, all of it? He looked at his coffee mug. I'm fine. That was very convincing, she said flatly. He almost laughed. He didn't quite get there, but almost. I'm tired, he said. I'm working the store 40 hours a week, and then coming home and doing this. I've got Owen, and his parent-teacher conference is next week, and I haven't sent back the field trip form yet, and the gutters need cleaning. And the space heater in the garage is going to die. He paused. But I'm okay. I know what I'm doing and why. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. The field trip form, she said. Is it the one on the refrigerator? The yellow one? I signed Owen's permission slips twice last month when he brought them over, where I keep stamps. Logan stared at her. He didn't tell me that, he said. He didn't want you to feel bad about forgetting. She picked up her pen again. I'm not trying to overstep. He just came over and asked. Logan thought about his son walking next door with a permission slip and not mentioning it. Thank you, he said. You don't have to thank me. She uncapped the pen. The media approach. Can we talk through it? He pulled his chair slightly closer to the table. Yeah, he said. Let's talk through it. The feature article came out on a Thursday in mid-November, published in a restoration magazine with a substantial print readership and an online presence that, according to Sienna's research, reached a dedicated audience of over 200,000 people in the vintage automotive world. Gerald had connected them with the journalist, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been covering automotive history for 20 years and whose work Logan had read without knowing it was hers. She'd spent an afternoon in the garage and 2 hours at the kitchen table and had asked questions that were better than Logan expected and more personal than he was comfortable with, which he supposed was the point. The piece was called The 100 Car and the Man Who Refused to Sell It. Logan read it at 6 in the morning before Owen woke up. He read it twice. It was good, better than he'd expected, honest about the difficulties and the gaps in funding, without making it feel like a charity case. And the section about Arthur Vale and Eleanor was written with a care that made something tight happen in his chest. He texted Eleanor a link. She called him 20 minutes later. She didn't say anything for a moment when he picked up. It's very good, she said finally, her voice doing that careful, steady thing again. He said. She got him right, Eleanor said. The part about how he worked, she got it right. Gerald gave her some of the technical documentation. I could tell. Logan, how are the finances? We're working on it. If there's anything I can, Eleanor, he said it gently. You've already given us more than I could calculate. His notebooks, the photographs, the contacts from the original team. He paused. That's the thing that makes this real. That's worth more than money. He heard her take a breath. He would have liked you, she said. Logan didn't know what to say to that. He sat with it for a moment. I hope so, he said. The article drove the crowdfunding past $120,000 by the end of the weekend. It also brought a wave of restoration specialists reaching out to volunteer time, expertise, and in 3 cases, specific components they'd been holding on to for years without knowing what they belonged to. And it brought another call from Victor Langford. $4 million, Langford said. Preamble this time. Logan was in the hardware store, stocking shelves. He held the phone against his shoulder and kept stacking boxes. He said, Mr. Mercer, Mr. Langford. Logan set a box down and gave the call his full attention. I appreciate that you keep calling. I understand what you're offering, and I understand what it would mean financially. But I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you're a straight-talking person, and you deserve that I am not going to sell you this car. At $4 million, not at $8 million. It's not about the money anymore. A long pause. Then what is it about? Langford asked. The smoothness was still there, but there was something underneath it now. Anger, something more like genuine curiosity. It's about the fact that Arthur Vale spent the last 30 years of his life thinking everything he built had been destroyed, Logan said. And his daughter spent those same 30 years watching that happen. And the only thing I can do about that is make sure the one thing that survived is somewhere that everyone can see it. He paused. Can your collection do that? Silence. My collection is exceptional, Langford said carefully. But it's yours. I need this to be everybody's. The silence that followed was longer, this time. You're going to have a funding problem, Langford said eventually, threatening, observing. The costs on a restoration like this will exceed what crowdfunding alone can support. Logan said, I'm working on it. If you need a different arrangement. Langford stopped. Start it again. If the conversation is ever about something other than a private sale, I'm willing to have it. Logan thought about that for a second. I'll keep that in mind, he said. He didn't know it yet, but that conversation would matter later. Right now, he put the phone in his pocket and went back to stacking shelves. The problem Langford had named the funding gap was real and getting realer. By December, with the crowdfunding campaign plateauing around $140,000 and the structural work on the chassis alone projected to run past 90, Sienna had laid out a spreadsheet one evening that showed clearly and without sifting it what the math looked like. You're going to run short, she said. I know. Significantly short, unless something changes. Sienna, she looked at him across the table. Owen was asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way it got on cold nights when the furnace kicked on and off with a low, steady rhythm. There's a foundation, she said. The Whitfield Automotive Heritage Foundation. They've supported 4 restoration projects in the last 8 years, 2 of which involved significant vehicles with contested ownership or incomplete provenance. They have a formal application process, but Gerald knows the director. What's the catch? Logan said. No catch. They provide funding and operational, and in exchange, the vehicle is placed in their care for permanent public exhibition. You retain ownership and final authority on decisions. Logan turned that over. I keep the car legally. Yes. They become custodians. They handle insurance, security, maintenance, exhibition. You keep control of what happens to it. He stared at the spreadsheet. It's a good arrangement, Sienna said quietly. For a car that you never wanted to own for yourself anyway. He looked at her. What do you mean? You never wanted to own it in the sense of have it, keep it. It was never about possessing it. She chose her words carefully. I've watched you work on this for 2 months. You treat it like something you're responsible for. It's not something you own. There's a difference. The furnace kicked on. Logan looked at the table for a long moment. My wife used to say I had a habit of taking care of things that couldn't take care of themselves, he said. Old machines, half-broken things. Sienna was quiet. She wasn't wrong, he said. Outside, the first real snow of winter was coming down. Logan could see it through the kitchen window, falling slow and steady through the porch light, landing on the driveway where a rusted coupe had sat three months ago and changed the direction of his life without any warning at all. "Call Gerald," he said. "Let's find out what an application to Whitfield looks like." Sienna made the note. The restoration was going to happen. The shape of how was still being worked out, the money was still complicated, and the gap between what existed and what was needed was still real and not going anywhere. But it was going to happen. Logan got up, rinsed his coffee mug in the sink, and looked out the window at the snow. He thought about Arthur Vale, teaching shop classes in rural Indiana, believing all three of his prototypes had been reduced to scrap metal, believing the accident had taken everything. Some things couldn't be fixed, but some things could. The Whitfield Automotive Heritage Foundation accepted their application in February. Gerald called with the news on a Tuesday morning while Logan was at work, and Logan had to excuse himself to the back room and stand next to the water heater for a few minutes before he trusted his voice enough to call Sienna. She answered on the second ring, heard his tone before he said anything, and asked immediately, "Yes or no?" "Yes," he said. She exhaled. Not a dramatic sound, just a breath releasing. The way it does when you've been holding something tightly for longer than you realized. "Okay," she said. "Good. That's good, Logan. The funding covers about 60% of the projected cost. We'll figure out the rest." He went back to work and spent the rest of his shift thinking about Arthur Vale. Not about the car, not about the money, not about the logistics that were going to consume the next several months of his life. Just about a man in a community college classroom, 30 years after the worst thing that had ever happened to him, teaching teenagers how to use a torque wrench. Whether he'd talked about it, whether he'd tried to forget it, whether forgetting had even been possible. Logan had never been particularly good at forgetting things either. The restoration officially began in March, in a rented commercial space on the east side of town that the foundation hoped to secure 3 times the floor area of Logan's garage, with proper ventilation, a lift, better lighting, and a separate area that Sienna had designated for documentation and archival work. The move out of the garage was bittersweet in a way Logan hadn't anticipated. He'd stood in the empty space the morning after the car was trailered over and looked at the faint full stain on the concrete, where the coupe had sat for 4 months and felt something he couldn't quite name. Owen had come out and stood next to him. "It's kind of weird," Owen said. Logan agreed. "It'll still be our project, though." Logan put his hand briefly on the back of the kid's neck. "Yep, always." Owen seemed satisfied with that, and went inside to find his cleats, and Logan stayed in the garage for another few minutes with the oil stain and the memory of those first nights, just him and 2 shop lamps and something extraordinary hidden under 50 years of rust, and the particular quiet of a house where a 7-year-old was asleep and the rest of the world hadn't found out yet. Then he closed the garage and drove to the shop. The team that assembled over the following weeks was not what Logan would have designed if he'd been designing it on paper. Dwight and Carol came on formally, which was expected. Marcus helped on weekends, which Logan had counted on. 3 specialists from the restoration community people who'd reached out after the magazine article joined in varying capacities, each bringing specific expertise in areas where the project needed it most. One of them, a man named Pete Sauer, had spent 20 years working exclusively on vintage racing vehicles, and spoke about period-correct fabrication with the intensity of someone describing a personal moral code. What Logan hadn't expected was the old men. The first one showed up on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, standing in the doorway of the shop with a cardboard box and a manner that combined genuine uncertainty with a kind of quiet dignity that Logan responded to immediately. His name was Walter Briggs. He was 78 years old. He had worked as a fabricator for Creston Motorsport from 969 through the program's end in 1972. "Saw the article," Walter said. He was looking at the car, at what was visible of it in its current half-disassembled state, with an expression that was complicated enough that Logan didn't try to interpret it. "Didn't think I'd ever see one of these again." Logan came around from where he'd been working and extended his hand. Walter shook it with a grip that was still solid. "You worked with Arthur Vale. Logan said. 4 years. Walter set his box down on the workbench. I was one of his fabricators. I was 25 when we started. Didn't know much, but he was patient about it. He paused. He was always patient. That was the thing about him. You could tell him you'd done something wrong, and he'd just say, "All right, let's figure out how to fix it." Logan looked at the box. "What's in there?" he said. Walter opened the flaps. Inside were notebooks, 4 of them, spiral-bound, their covers soft with age. Underneath the notebooks, a thick stack of photographs in a manila envelope. And underneath that, rolled carefully in a tube of brown packing paper, something that turned out to be an original blueprint, a chassis diagram, hand-drawn, with notations in a small, precise handwriting that Logan had come to recognize from the photocopied documents Eleanor had sent. Arthur Vale's handwriting. Logan stood at the workbench and looked at it all. "I kept thinking I should do something with this," Walter said, after I saw the article. "Kept telling my wife somebody should see this." He shrugged, an old man's shrug, the movement of a person who had made peace with uncertainty. "Here I am." Logan looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that the 2 words weren't really big enough to hold. Walter stayed for 3 hours that first day, and came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. He brought his wife once, a small woman named Ruth, who sat in the corner with coffee and watched the work with the expression of someone who had seen her husband pursue this particular shape of grief for 50 years and was glad, finally, that it had somewhere to go. Walter was not the only one. Over the following 6 weeks, 4 more surviving members of Vale's original team made contact. 2 came in person. 2 were too far away or too old to travel, but sent photographs, handwritten notes, and in one case an audio recording an elderly man's voice, wavering but precise, going through his memories of specific builds and what Vale had been trying to achieve with each one. Gerald spent 2 full days in the shop just doing archival interviews, and the footage and documentation that accumulated filled 3 external hard drives and started requiring its own organizational system. Project had become something different from what Logan had set out to do. He understood this on a Thursday evening in April, when he was alone in the shop after everyone else had gone home, going over the chassis repair documentation with Dwight's notes spread across the workbench, and he stopped in the middle of a page and looked at the car and just sat with it for a moment. No, he was not restoring a vehicle. He was reconstructing a person. The choices and instincts and specific technical judgments of a man who'd been dead for 20 years, encoded in metal and in the memories of the people who'd worked alongside him, preserved by accident and luck, and an old salvage yard owner who'd wanted $100 to clear space in his 3rd row. It was a strange feeling. Not heavy, exactly. More like weight distributed properly, the kind you can carry for a long time if you've got the right posture. He texted Eleanor that night. "The notebooks Walter brought are extraordinary. His handwriting is very precise," she replied. After 10 minutes, he was precise about everything. "Drove my mother a little crazy. He measured things twice in the kitchen, too." Logan stared at that for a moment, then wrote back, "That sounds right." The first serious problem arrived in May. It started as a feeling, one of those low background feelings that Logan had learned to trust over years of working with machinery, the sense that something is not quite right before you can articulate specifically what. He'd been doing a final inspection of the chassis repair work on the right-hand section, Dwight working alongside him, when he'd noticed the way the light hit a joint that had been considered sound. "Hold on," he said. Dwight stopped. Logan got his light close and looked, and then looked again, and felt the feeling sharpen into something specific and unpleasant. "That's not right," he said. It was a hairline, a crack in the original chassis metal adjacent to the repaired section, invisible in normal light, only visible at this angle with the work light positioned just so. It was not in the repaired area. It was in metal that had been examined and cleared 3 months ago. They spent the rest of the day on it. By evening, they'd found 2 more stress fractures in areas of the chassis that had been considered structurally stable. The news was not catastrophic, the car was not unsalvageable, but it added scope and cost to the structural work that pushed the total projected budget significantly past the foundation's contribution and what the crowdfunding had raised. Sienna was in the shop when Dwight laid it out. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Logan had come to respect about her. She didn't perform, concern, or rush to fill silences. She let information land before she responded to it. "How much?" she said when Dwight was done. Dwight gave her a number. She looked at Logan. "Okay," she said. Logan started. "I heard it, and we'll deal with it." She was already writing. "There are 2 grant programs I've been holding in reserve for a situation where we needed supplemental funding that had legitimate cause. This is legitimate cause. I'll have applications drafted by the end of the week." Sienna and the documentary filmmaker who called in November. She looked up. "I know you said no, but a properly structured documentary arrangement can include production funding that goes directly toward the project. It's not charity, it's a licensing arrangement. There's a difference." Logan pressed his palm against the workbench. He was tired. He'd been tired for 2 months in the particular way you get when the end of something keeps moving. "I'll think about it," he said. "Think fast," she said, without sharpness. "The math is getting tight." That night, Logan sat in the shop alone after everyone else had left. He did this sometimes, just sat, working, not reading, just present with the car and the silence and the specific smell of the shop that had become familiar to him over the past months, metal and oil, and the faint chemical scent of the cleaning compounds. He was tired. That was honest. He was tired, and the project was harder and more expensive than he'd thought, and Victor Langford's voice occasionally came back to him at odd moments. The mathematics of idealism become more complicated. And he didn't think Langford had been wrong. Exactly. Just that he'd been describing the wrong math. The right math, as Logan understood it, wasn't about what the car was worth. Yes, he'd interviewed her. It was about what it would cost to be the kind of person who looked at Eleanor Vale Greer's voice on the phone and decided her father's life's work was worth less than his own debt relief. He couldn't do it. He'd known it from the first night in the garage, and $2 million, and then 3 and then 4, had not changed the fundamental shape of what he knew. He called Sienna. She picked up immediately, which meant she'd been awake. "The filmmaker," he said. "Call him." A pause. "All right," she said. "But I want to be involved in every conversation about what the documentary covers. It's not just a fundraising vehicle. It's got to be about Vale. Of course. And Eleanor has to approve anything related to her father's personal history. Obviously," he exhaled. "Okay, Logan." Her voice was different for a moment, not professional, not organized, just present. "You're doing the right thing." "I know," he said. "It's still hard." "Yeah," she said. "That's generally how you know it's the right thing." He sat with that for a moment in the quiet of the shop. "Go to sleep," he said. "You too," she said. The suspicious pressure started in June. It was small things at first. A padlock that had been replaced with one that looked identical, but wasn't, Logan noticed, because the key felt different, and he'd been using the same lock for 6 months. A set of component photographs went missing from the documentation archive, which Carol discovered, and which might have been misfiled, except that Sienna's organizational system was meticulous enough that misfiling was nearly impossible. A man turned up twice at the shop, claiming to be a journalist, asking questions that were too specific and in the wrong order, and who couldn't name his publication consistently across 2 conversations. Logan brought it to Gerald. Gerald was quiet for a long time. "I don't want to be dramatic about this," Gerald said finally. "But there are people in the collector world who have resources and motivation, and who don't respond well to being told no repeatedly." "You think it's Langford," Logan said. I don't know," Gerald said carefully. "I think you should be careful." Logan thought about the conversation in the hardware store. If the conversation is ever about something other than a private sale, I'm willing to have it. He'd held on to that because it had seemed like a door left open, something potentially useful. It felt different. No, he wasn't sure what it had meant. He tightened security at the shop. He worked with Sienna to document the irregularities carefully, in case they needed a record of them later. He told Marcus, who responded with the controlled anger of a loyal person and the practical suggestion of a security camera, which Logan installed the following weekend. He did not confront Langford directly. He had no proof of anything, and he wasn't going to accuse a man without proof. But he drove home from the shop that evening with his hands tighter on the wheel than usual. Owen was still up when he got home, sitting at the kitchen table with the engineering history of Sienna. had brought him 3 months ago, a pad of his own sticky notes, marking what appeared to be every third page. "Dad," Owen said, looking up, "did you know that the reason some vintage race car chassis cracked wasn't because they were bad engineering? It was because the metal got stressed in ways nobody planned for yet." Logan stood in the doorway for a second. "Where'd you read that?" "Page 64. Owen pointed at his sticky note. "I put a star on it because I thought it was relevant to our car." Logan came over and sat down across from him. He looked at the book, at the starred sticky note, at his son's careful handwriting on the tab, "Relevant to our car." "You're right," he said. "It is relevant." Owen looked pleased. "I'm going to show Sienna tomorrow. She'll want to see it," Logan said. He sat at the table for a while after Owen went to bed, with the book and the sticky notes and the engineering diagram. Owen had drawn himself in the margins, slightly in its proportions, completely recognizable in its intent. The project was hard and expensive, and someone was possibly messing with it, and he was tired in his bones. All of that was true, and he had a 7-year-old who was studying metal stress theory with sticky notes because it was relevant to their car. Was also true, and it was the thing that mattered. The hidden plate came to light on a Thursday in late July. They'd been doing finish work on the interior structure, careful, slow work, the kind that required patience and good light, and a willingness to stop and look before every action. Pete Sauer was leading that section of the restoration, moving through the driver's compartment with the deliberate attention he gave everything. Logan was across the shop, working with Dwight on the suspension documentation, when Pete called out. Loudly, "Just Logan, come here." The tone was enough. Logan crossed the shop and crouched down beside Pete, who had a light aimed at the underside of the dashboard structure, at a section of the original metal that had been hidden behind a panel they'd removed an hour earlier. "What am I looking at?" Logan said. That, Pete pointed, was a plate small, maybe 3 inches by 4 inches, riveted flush to the metal so that it would have been invisible with the dashboard panel in place. The surface was dark with age, and the rivets had corroded, but the plate itself was intact, and the letters pressed into its surface were still readable. Logan moved his light closer. The text was brief, 3 lines pressed in small, careful characters. "This was my finest work. I hope whoever finds this did not waste it." The shop was completely quiet. Pete didn't say anything. Logan didn't say anything. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street. Logan read it again, then again. He sat back on his heels and put his hand against the side of the car, just flat palmed against the metal, the way you'd put your hand on someone's shoulder. He wasn't thinking about why. He just did it. "You okay?" Pete said quietly. Logan said. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. He took photographs of the plate himself, from 4 different angles. Then he called Gerald. Then he called Eleanor. Eleanor didn't say anything for a long moment after he read the words to her. She said finally, "Knew what?" "That it would survive." Her voice was doing the thing again, that careful, loaded steadiness. He knew this one was different. He hid that plate because he thought someday, someone. She stopped. He must have hoped. Logan looked at the plate. "I hope whoever finds this did not waste it." "Was right," Logan said. "We haven't wasted it." She said, "You haven't." The plate changed the temperature of the project in ways that were hard to explain but easy to feel. Word spread through the team by end of day, and there was a shift in the shop. The following morning, not dramatic, ceremonial, just the quality of the attention people brought to the work. Pete Sauer, who was not a sentimental man in any conventional sense, was noticeably quieter and more deliberate. Dwight took an extra half hour with a section of work that was already within acceptable tolerances because he wanted it better than acceptable. Walter came in that Friday, and Logan showed him the plate. The old man stood very still in front of it for a long time. "That's his handwriting," Walter said. "I know. I'd know it anywhere." Walter touched the edge of the plate, not the lettering, just the frame of the metal. "Used to leave notes or workbenches when he wanted us to check something. Same writing." He stepped back. His eyes were dry, but there was something in his face that had the quality of a door that had been closed for a very long time and had just quietly opened. Walter said, "Yeah," Logan said, "all those years." Walter shook his head slowly. He never talked about the cars after it ended. Not once in all the time I knew him after. It was like the accident took his voice about it. but he hoped. They stood side by side in front of the car. "We're going to finish it," Logan said. "I know you are," Walter said. "I've been watching you work." He'd be glad it was someone like you. Logan didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure the compliment was accurate. He'd made plenty of mistakes on this project, missed things, gotten frustrated, made decisions that had needed revising. He was not the kind of person who appeared in stories about this kind of thing. He was tired and in debt, and his gutters were still not clean. He was finishing it. That had to count for something. Victor Langford called in September. Logan was in the shop when the call came, late afternoon, the light coming through the high windows at the low angle. That meant autumn was settling in. The car was beginning to look like a car again. The structural work was complete. The body panels were being fitted, and the specific dark blue of the original finish was being carefully matched from the paint fragments they'd preserved during disassembly. "I want to apologize," Langford said. Logan stopped what he was doing. "For what?" he said. A pause. "There were some irregularities around your shop earlier this year," Langford said. "The lock, the photographs." Logan was very still. "I want to be clear that I didn't authorize anything." That Langford stopped. Started again. The smoothness in his voice was still there, but something under it had changed. He sounded like a man who had done a particular kind of accounting and found the numbers worse than expected. "I had people making inquiries on my behalf. Was too vague about what was and wasn't acceptable," as Logan said. "Yes." A pause. "I'm not calling to negotiate. I understand the car is spoken for, and the arrangement with Whitfield is final. I'm calling because..." Another pause, longer this time. "I've been following the project. The documentation. The plate you found." He stopped. "I collect because I genuinely care about these machines, what they represent. And somewhere in the past several months, I stopped behaving like someone who genuinely cared and started behaving like someone who just wanted to win." Logan didn't say anything. "I don't have a better way to say it than that," Langford said. Logan looked at the car. The deep blue was coming together panel by panel, section by section. Was not finished, but it was becoming something. "I appreciate the call," Logan said. "I mean that. Is there anything..." Langford hesitated. "Is there anything the project still needs?" "Without conditions." Logan thought about it. "There might be," he said. "I'll let you know." He meant it as a dismissal, but not an unkind one. Langford took it correctly and said goodbye and hung up. And Logan stood in the shop for a moment with the phone in his hand and the smell of paint and the low autumn light and the car almost completely itself again in front of him. He thought about what it had taken to get here. The $100 gamble at a salvage yard. The crowdfunding campaign that Marcus had accidentally started. The nights at the kitchen table with Sienna and her legal pad. Walter with his box of notebooks. Eleanor's voice on the phone. The plate with its 3 lines of careful, hopeful handwriting. The restoration was not yet complete. There were weeks of work still ahead. Final fitting, mechanical work, the documentation process the foundation required, the planning for the exhibition itself. But the car that had sat in Pete Hendrix's third row for 2 years, buried under a torn tarp and 30 years of other people's indifference, was almost a car again. Arthur Vale's finest work, almost itself again. Logan picked up his tools and went back to work. The car was finished on a Wednesday in late October, 18 months after Logan had pulled a torn blue tusked tarp off something extraordinary in the third row of a salvage yard and spent $100 he couldn't really afford. He was alone in the shop when it happened, when the last piece of the restoration process was documented, signed off, and complete. The rest of the team had been in and out all week for final checks and sign-offs, but Wednesday afternoon had emptied out naturally, the way endings sometimes do, leaving Logan by himself with the finished car under the shop lights. He stood in front of it for a long time. The deep blue was exactly right. They'd spent 3 weeks on the color alone, working from the paint fragments and from a photograph Walter had produced from his box of notebooks, a faded color photo of prototype. 3 during a test session in 9,971, parked on a section of track in afternoon light. The color in the photograph had shifted over 50 years, and matching it had required Gerald consulting with 2 separate paint specialists and 1 retired chemist who specialized in automotive lacquers from the period. Standing in front of it now, Logan thought they'd gotten it. Perfect, perfect. Not perfect, he didn't trust he'd learned. Over the course of this project, perfect was what you called something when you hadn't looked at it closely enough. But right, the color was right. The proportions he'd felt in his hands the first day he'd lifted that tarp were visible now, unobstructed, the way Arthur Vale had intended them to be. He took out his phone and took one photograph. Then he put the phone away and just stood there. He was thinking about the last year and a half. Not in a linear way, more the way memory actually works, in fragments and textures. And the sticky notes. Walter's face when he'd seen the hidden plate. Sienna at the kitchen table at 11 at night with her legal pad and a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Gerald's voice doing that compressed, careful thing it did when he was working hard at being calm. Eleanor saying he would have liked you. Marcus sending him a 6-word text that just said, bro. You actually did it, bro. He thought about Karen. He didn't always let himself do that because it took him places that were hard to come back from, and he had a kid who needed him present. But standing in front of this car alone, he let himself think about her for a few minutes. She'd have had opinions about all of it. Sharp ones. She'd have been simultaneously proud and exasperated, which was her standard operating mode when it came to Logan's instincts, and she'd have been right on both counts. He missed her in the particular, specific way that doesn't get smaller with time, just more familiar. He stayed until the light outside the high windows went dark. Then he locked up and drove home. The exhibition opening was scheduled for the second Saturday of November at the Whitfield Foundation's exhibition space, 3 hours away. The weeks between the completion of the restoration and the opening were the most logistically complex of the entire project, which was saying something, and Sienna managed them with a focus that Logan had come to recognize as her version of the same thing he did in the shop, the state of complete absorption where the world narrowed down to the task and everything else fell away. She coordinated transportation for the car with the Foundation's logistics team. She arranged accommodations for Walter and the other surviving team members who were traveling. She handled the media requests that had multiplied odds significantly after the documentary filmmaker released a 6-minute preview clip online. She managed the credentials process for the journalists with the careful attention of someone who understood that the wrong coverage could still damage something important even at this late stage. Logan handled the people. He called Eleanor twice a week in the final stretch. He made sure Walter knew exactly what to expect. The old man had mentioned twice, without making a big thing of it, that large crowds were harder for him than they used to be, and Logan had arranged with the Foundation for Walter and the other team members to have quiet access to the car the evening before the public opening. He called each of the original team members personally to confirm they were coming and to ask if they needed anything. He also called Langford. This surprised himself slightly, but when he sat with the impulse for a day and still thought it was right, he trusted it. The project has a documentation archive, Logan said. Photographs, engineering notebooks, Walter Briggs's materials, everything. The Foundation is going to digitize it and make it publicly accessible, but they need funding to do it properly. How Langford said. Logan told him. A pause. Done, Langford said. Send me the Foundation's information, and I'll have it transferred this week. Conditions, Logan said. No naming rights, no private access, nothing that puts your name on it in a way that shapes how people experience it. I understand, Langford said. And then, after a moment, I think I'm starting to, anyway. It wasn't the most graceful concession Logan had ever heard. But it was honest, and he valued that. Thank you, Logan said. Thank me, Langford said. Just make sure it's done right. That's been the plan from the beginning, Logan said. The Foundation's chief curator, a woman named Dr. Adele Marsh, called Logan 4 days before the opening. Her voice had a quality that made him sit up straighter, not alarmed exactly, but alert. The same feeling he got in the shop when something wasn't quite right before he could name it. We've completed the final documentation sweep of the vehicle, Dr. Marsh said. Standard procedure before an exhibition opens. Our team goes over everything one more time. She paused. We found something. Found something, he repeated. A compartment. In the lower section of the driver's seat structure, it's integrated into the frame in a way that's consistent with the original fabrication. Our conservator almost missed it. Another pause. It was sealed. The seal is original, same materials, same age as the rest of the car. Bodies opened it since the car was built. Logan was standing in his kitchen. Owen was doing homework at the table. The furnace was running. "What's in it?" he said. "Documents," Dr. Marsh said. "Several items. We haven't fully cataloged them yet. I wanted to call you first, since you're the owner of record." "Logan, from what we can see." She stopped. "Then I think you should come." "Can you come tomorrow?" He looked at Owen. "Yeah," he said. "I can come tomorrow." He brought Sienna. He didn't plan to, he'd planned to drive down alone. The way he handled most things that felt significant. Inez intervened, but when he went next door that evening to let her know he'd be out of town the following day and might need her to keep an eye on Owen, she read his face and said, "I'm coming." Something happened. She said it as a statement, not a question. "What is it?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went inside to get her jacket. They drove down the following morning, 3 hours, with Owen in the back seat, asleep for the first hour and awake, and reading his engineering book for the second, and asking questions about the car and the exhibition for the third. Logan answered when he could, and let Sienna handle the more logistically complex questions, which she did with the ease of someone who had spent the past 18 months becoming genuinely fluent in the subject. At one point, Owen fell quiet for a few minutes, looking out the window at the fields going by. "Dad," he said, "yeah. Do you think Mr. Vale knew someone would find his car someday?" Logan thought about the hidden plate. "I hope whoever finds this did not waste it." "I think he hoped," Logan said. "But he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure." Owen considered this. "That's sad," he said. "Hoping for something and not being sure." "It is," Logan agreed. "But the hoping is still worth something, even when you're not sure." Owen looked back out the window. "Okay," he said, in the tone he used when he was filing something away for later thought. Sienna was looking at the road ahead. Logan didn't look at her directly, but he could see in his peripheral vision that something in her expression had shifted, something quiet and private. Dr. Marsh met them at the Foundation's facility and took them to the conservation room, where the documents had been laid out on an archival examination table under controlled lighting. She was a careful, precise woman in her 50s who reminded Logan slightly of Gerald, the same quality of taking things seriously without making a performance of it. The documents were in remarkable condition, given their age. The sealed compartment had protected them from moisture and light for 50 years, and the materials themselves were good quality, the kind of paper and ink that lasted when treated well. There were 3 items. The first was a rolled set of blueprints, chassis diagrams, system schematics, the kind of complete engineering documentation that represented the full technical specification of Prototype 3 as Vale had built it. Yes, he'd intervened. Gerald, who Logan had called from the road, would later confirm these were the missing originals that Vale's estate had never been able to locate, that everyone had assumed were either destroyed or lost. The second item was a set of engineering notebooks, different from the ones Walter had brought, more formal, with Vale's small, precise handwriting moving across the pages in complete, organized entries, a daily journal, more like a professional record. Every significant engineering decision, every test result, every modification, and the reasoning behind it. The third item was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, dated 3 weeks before the accident that ended everything. Dr. Marsh had made photocopies. She set a set in front of Logan and stepped back to give him space. He read it standing up, because sitting down didn't occur to him. The letter was addressed to no one specific. It was written as if Vale understood or suspected that it might not be read for a very long time. His tone was direct and undefended, the tone of a man writing something he needed to put somewhere outside himself. Nope. He wrote about the 3 prototypes and what he'd been trying to achieve with each of them. He wrote about the program and about Henry Creston, and about the team Walter got mentioned by name twice, with specific appreciation for his fabrication instincts. He wrote about Raymond Colt, the driver, who would die 6 months later in the testing accident. And it was clear from the way he wrote about him that they'd been genuinely close, not just professionally, but in the specific way that people become close when they spend years working toward the same difficult thing. On the 3rd page, Vale wrote about the concerns he'd been raising internally for months before the accident. The testing program had been pushed too fast. Creston was losing patience with incremental development and had applied pressure to accelerate the schedule in ways Vale had documented his objections to, formally and in writing, multiple times. Safety equipment Vale had specified as necessary for high-speed testing had not been procured cost, he'd been told. The budget was tight, and the timeline was aggressive, and the equipment would come later. It had not come later. Vale wrote about this without bitterness, which made it harder to read, not easier. He wrote about it the way you write about something you've had a very long time to accept, clearly without embellishment, just the facts as he understood them. The safety failures that contributed to Raymond's death were documented by me in advance as risks. I raised them. They were not addressed. The investigation that followed focused on engineering cause because engineering was containable, attributable, something that could be pointed at without implicating the decisions and economies that had created the conditions for it. I was the engineer. I became the answer. I'm not writing this to defend myself. Raymond is dead, and no document will change that, and I do not expect to spend the rest of my life walking away from that weight. But the weight I carry honestly is not the same as the weight that has been assigned to me. I hope whoever reads this understands the difference. Logan set the photocopy down on the examination table. He pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed. Sienna was standing beside him. She'd been reading over his shoulder for the last 2 pages. She didn't say anything, and he was grateful for that. The investigation findings, Logan said to Dr. Marsh. Is there a way to... Gerald is already on it, Sienna said quietly. He looked at her. I called him from the hallway, she said, while you were on the second page. He looked at her for a moment. She was watching him with the clear, direct attention she brought to everything that mattered, and underneath the practicality of what she'd done, calling Gerald, being one step ahead, there was something else. Something that had been building in increments across 18 months of kitchen tables, and a project that had taken both of them somewhere neither of them had planned to go. He looked back at the document. He carried this for 30 years, Logan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Dr. Marsh said. And the people who should have... He stopped. The investigation they let it land on him. From what the letter describes, and what the original investigation record shows, Dr. Marsh said carefully, the findings were not fabricated, but they were incomplete. The engineering factors that contributed to the accident were real. The safety and scheduling factors that compounded them were documented, but not weighted appropriately in the final findings. Logan stood up straight. What does it take, he said, to have that corrected, formally? Dr. Marsh looked at him for a moment. That's a process, she said. It would require the relevant historical racing bodies to review new evidence. Gerald would know who to contact. It wouldn't be fast, but it's possible. With this documentation, she looked at the table. Yes, I think it's possible. Owen had been sitting quietly on a chair in the corner of the room this entire time, reading his engineering book, in the way he sometimes removed himself from adult conversations he understood were important. He looked up. Dad, he said. Is it bad? Logan looked at his son. It's something that needs fixing, he said. We're going to fix it. Nodded and went back to his book. Eleanor answered on the first ring. Logan was outside in the Foundation's parking lot, in the cold November air, because this was a conversation he needed to have without walls around it. Eleanor, he said, we found something in the car. I need to tell you about it, and I need you to be sitting down. He heard the shift, on the other end of the line, the small adjustments of someone preparing themselves. All right, she said. He told her about the compartment, about the blueprints and the notebooks, and then he told her about the letter. He read her the parts that mattered, slowly, clearly, stopping when he needed to. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. He documented it, she said, in a shocked way, in the way of someone who is hearing a confirmation of something they've known, without proof, for a very long time. He documented all of it. Yes, he told me once. She stopped. When I was about 17, he sat with me, and he said, Eleanor, I need you to know that I did everything I could to keep Raymond safe. He said it once, and he never said it again. And I believed him, but I didn't. Her voice shifted. What to do with it? There was nowhere to put it. There's somewhere to put it now, Logan said. She was quiet again. The exhibition, she said finally. Is it still? Nothing changes about the exhibition, Logan said. Everything we planned still happens. This is additional to that. This is the rest of the story. The true rest, she said. He could hear her breathing. Steady and careful, the way she always was. The quality of a person who had learned to hold difficult things without being broken by them. My father taught for 23 years, she said, at that community college. He was a good teacher. That because I met some of his students at his funeral and the things they said about him. She paused. He gave all of that to those kids. All the precision and the patience. He couldn't put it anywhere else, so he gave it to them. Logan stood in the parking lot. The cold was sharp. He could see his breath. The exhibition is going to show what he built, he said. The documentation is going to show who he was and what actually happened. And the historical record is going to be corrected. All of it. I'm not stopping at one of those. I know you're not, Eleanor said. I knew that about you from the first phone call. The evening before the public opening, the foundation let Walter and the other surviving team members have the exhibition space to themselves. Logan arranged it, but he stood back once he'd brought them in. This wasn't his moment. There were 4 of them, Walter and 3 others, men in their 70s and 80s who moved with the careful deliberateness of people who'd learned not to trust their joints completely. They'd met each other in the parking lot outside, with the slightly formal awkwardness of people who'd shared something enormous and hadn't seen each other in decades. And then the formality had dissolved within about 3 minutes into something easier and older. The exhibition space was properly lit and carefully arranged. The car sat at the center of it. Around it, the documentation and archival materials were displayed, photographs from the original testing program, excerpts from the engineering notebooks, a timeline of the program's history, portraits of the team. Arthur Vale's photograph was at the center of the archival wall. Gerald had found it, a formal photograph from sometime in the late 1960s, black and white, the kind they took when programs were being formally documented. Vale looked about 45. He was not smiling, exactly, but there was something in his expression that Logan had looked at many times over the past months and kept coming back to a quality of concentration that had the feeling of depth, the look of a person whose inner life was considerably larger than its external expression. Walter stood in front of that photograph for a long time. Then he walked to the car and put both hands on the hood, just rested them there. The other 3 came to stand nearby, and there was a period of quiet that Logan, watching from the doorway, understood was not empty, but full of 50 years of a specific kind of grief that didn't have a clean name, the kind you carry when something you built and believed in was taken away before it could be what it was supposed to be. Logan looked at Sienna beside him. She was watching Walter with the expression of someone who had come a long way from the person who'd stood at the property line with her arms crossed, looking at a rusted wreck and questioning her neighbor's judgment. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Yeah," she said, just as quietly. "Are you?" "Getting there," he said. She nodded, and without making a thing of it, she moved about 3 inches closer to him in the doorway, and he didn't move away. And they stood like that while Walter and the old men stood around the car, and the exposition space was quiet and full at the same time. The public opening began at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. The line outside the foundation was longer than anyone had projected. Dr. Marsh mentioned this to Logan with an expression of pleased surprise, which he appreciated. He'd worried in the dark morning hours of 3 or 4 different nights over the past months about whether anyone outside the vintage racing community would actually come. Whether the story would land for ordinary people or just enthusiasts. The answer apparently was both. The crowd was wide older couples, families with kids, people who'd clearly come specifically for the car, and people who seemed to have brought their children as a kind of experience without knowing exactly what to expect. The documentary preview had reached more people than Logan had realized. The magazine article had been shared more broadly than he'd tracked. Eleanor arrived at 9:30 before the doors opened, and Logan met her in the parking lot. He'd seen photographs. Eleanor had sent one with an email some months back, a casual family photo, but photographs were different from the actual person. She was 61 years old, trim, with her father's quality of carrying herself, precisely without appearing rigid. She had a directness in her eyes that Logan recognized because he'd read about it in the archived accounts of people who'd worked with her father. She took his hand with both of hers and held it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I know I've said it before, but I needed to say it here, in person today." "You don't need to," he said. "I need to," she said firmly, and the firmness was so much like the quality he'd felt in her voice from the very first phone call that he almost smiled. He walked her inside, to the car before the public came in. She stood in front of it for a while, without saying anything. Logan stood nearby and let her look. He'd learned over the course of this project that the things that mattered most didn't need to be filled with words. "It's beautiful," she said eventually. "He knew what he was doing," Logan said. "He did." She reached out and touched the edge of the front fender, just the tip of her fingers, briefly. "He really did." She looked at the archival wall, at her father's photograph. "I want to see the letter," she said. "The original." Is it here?" "It's in the conservation archive," Logan said. "Dr. Marsh can take you there whenever you want." "Today, or whenever you're ready," Eleanor said, after. He nodded. The doors opened at 10. Logan was asked to say a few words. This was not his preferred type of thing. Everyone who knew him understood this, which was why Gerald had offered to handle it, why Sienna had offered to write something for him, why Marcus had texted approximately 15 times with suggestions ranging from practical to completely unhelpful. He thanked all of them and said he'd do it himself. He stood in front of the car, with the crowd around him, a real crowd, more people than he had expected, their faces varied and attentive, and he looked at the car for just a moment before he spoke. The deep blue, the proportions that had stopped him cold in a salvage yard on a cold October morning 18 months ago. He talked about Arthur Vale, not about the car, first about the man. What the engineering notebooks revealed about how he thought and worked, and what he was trying to build, and why. About the letter and what it said and what it meant for the historical record, which Gerald and the First Nation were in the formal process of having reviewed by the relevant organizations. He talked about Walter and the other team members, and he gestured toward where they were standing, and people turned to look, and Walter got a small, surprised expression like a man who had not expected to be seen. He talked about what it meant that the car had survived, in an abstract way, in a specific way, that it had sat for 50 years in condition that should have destroyed it, and it hadn't been destroyed. And now it was here. Work that had made it was documented, and the man who had done the work was documented, and that was not an accident. That was what it looked like when something was built so well, and with such care that it outlasts the circumstances that tried to erase it. He talked for about 7 minutes. He didn't talk about himself much. He mentioned Owen, once his son, who was 8 now, and had spent a year and a half photographing every component of this restoration, and could probably tell you more about period-correct, vintage racing fabrication than most adults. People laughed at that. Owen, who was standing to the left of the crowd, went red in a pleased way and looked at his shoes. He thanked Sienna by name, and the team by name, and Walter by name. He did not talk about what the past 18 months had cost him, or what they'd changed, or the specific texture of what it felt like to have pursued this thing through all the ways it had been difficult. Wasn't what today was for. He ended simply. Arthur Vale hoped, he said, if anyone would find this car, or what they'd do with it if they did. He just hoped. I think the best thing we can do with what he left behind is make sure that hoping was worth it. He stepped back. The applause was real, the kind that starts before people plan it, that comes from something that actually landed. Logan looked at the car. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was standing near the archival wall, and she was looking back at him, and her expression was the same quality he'd heard in her voice from the very beginning, steady, and full of something that had finally, after a very long time, found a place to rest. He looked at Owen, who was grinning and not trying to hide it. He looked at Sienna, who was not clapping. She'd already moved to manage something in the logistics of the crowd, because that was who she was, except that she paused for just a second and met his eyes across the room. And what passed between them in that second was not a small thing. And he looked at Walter, who was no longer standing at the edge of the crowd, but was being led gently toward the car by one of the Foundation's staff, guided to a position directly in front of it, close enough to put his hands on it if he wanted to. Walter put his hands on it, both palms flat against the hood, the same way Logan had done it in the shop The night he'd first read the words on the hidden plate. The same instinct. The language that didn't need words. The crowd gave him space for that. And the car, blue and still and precisely, carefully, beautifully as itself, held him up. The debt didn't disappear the morning after the exhibition opened. Logan had known it wouldn't. He'd never been under any illusion about that the project had been funded through a combination of crowdfunding, foundation support, volunteer labor, and Langford's archival contribution, none of which had been structured to solve Logan Mercer's personal financial situation. He'd gone into this with his eyes open, and he'd come out of it with the restoration complete, and Arthur Vale's name properly attached to something extraordinary, and his mortgage still due on the 15th. He went back to work at the hardware store on the Monday after the opening. Dave, his manager, shook his hand when he walked in and said, "Hell of a thing you did," which was the most effusive thing Dave had said to anyone in the 11 years Logan had worked there. Dave handed him the week's delivery schedule, and they got on with it. Logan didn't mind. With something steadying about the hardware store, the specific, contained nature of the problems people brought in, the way he could help someone find the right fastener, or talk through a repair and have it be finished, resolved cut complete within the span of a single conversation. After 18 months of a project that had been never-ending in its complexity, there was genuine comfort in a problem with a clean solution. The phone kept ringing. The first call came from a museum curator in Ohio who had seen the documentary preview and wanted to discuss whether Logan might consult on an assessment of several vehicles in their collection, whose provenance was uncertain. The second came from a private collector in Michigan who had something in his barn. He described it carefully. And Logan listened carefully, and by the end of the conversation, he was fairly certain it was nothing particularly significant. But he drove out the following Saturday to look anyway, because you didn't dismiss things without looking. He was right that it wasn't significant, but he was also right to look, which was its own kind of lesson. Gerald called in December. "There's a foundation that's been trying to locate a specific vehicle for about 12 years, Gerald said. A handcrafted sports racer from the late 50s, built by a coach builder in Indiana who was working in the European style. Family sold the estate in the 90s, and the car disappeared into the secondary market. They've lost the trail." He paused. "They need someone who knows how to look for things that don't want to be found." Logan was sitting at the kitchen table. Owen was asleep. "That's a very specific skill set," Logan said. "Yes," Gerald said. "It is. And you have it." Logan turned his coffee mug slowly on the table. "What does it pay?" he said. Gerald told him. It was more than the hardware store paid in 4 months. "I'd need to take time off work," Logan said. "Yes, you would. Owen has school. The search would be regional. You'd be home most nights." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Let me think about it," he said. "Don't think too long," Gerald said. "They've been waiting 12 years. They're not going to wait much longer." He thought about it for 2 days. He talked to Owen about it, which was something he'd started doing more deliberately over the past year, not offloading adult problems onto an 8-year-old, but giving Owen the honest shape of things when the decisions affected both of them. Owen listened with the focused attention he brought to everything he considered important. "Would you still be home for dinner?" Owen asked. "Most nights." "Would you still come to my games?" "All of them." Owen considered. "The hardware store is kind of boring for you," he said. Logan blinked. "What makes you say that?" "Because you always look more awake when you're in the garage," Owen said, with the directness of a child who has been paying close attention for 8 years. "At the hardware store, you look like you're waiting for something." Logan looked at his son. "When did you get this smart?" he said. "I've always been this smart," Owen said. "You just ask more now." Logan called Gerald the next morning and said yes. The search took 6 weeks. 3 of which Logan spent driving a circuit of secondary dealers, estate auction records, and collector contacts across 4 states, following a trail that was 12 years cold and had been deliberately obscured at one point by a middleman who had apparently misrepresented the vehicle's provenance to facilitate a private sale. It was detailed, frustrating work that required patience and a tolerance for dead ends, and Logan was good at it in the same way he was good at reading salvage yards, not because he had any special gift, because he paid attention and didn't assume he knew what something was before he'd actually looked. He found the car in a storage facility outside of Indianapolis, buried under furniture and miscellaneous household items from what appeared to be 3 separate estate clearances, the kind of accumulated disorder that happens when a facility changed hands and nobody did proper inventory. The vehicle was in rough shape, but it was there, and it was real. And when Logan sent Gerald the photographs, Gerald made that compressed, careful sound again. "You found it," Gerald said. "It's in bad condition," Logan said. "It's findable. That's what matters." Standing in the storage facility, looking at another buried thing that had been waiting for someone to look carefully enough, Logan felt something settle in him, not excitement exactly, more like recognition. The same feeling he'd had in the 3rd row of Hendrick's salvage, lifting a torn blue tarp. His instinct proved repeatable. That was Gerald's phrase for it, and it was accurate. The foundation paid him. The museum in Ohio hired him for 2 weeks of consultation work in the spring. A collector association contacted him about doing provenance assessments for their annual authentication process. The work accumulated in the organic, unplanned way that work did when you were doing something you were genuinely built for, and the people in that world could tell. He left the hardware store in April. Dave shook his hand again when he told him, and said hell of a thing again, which Logan figured was Dave's all-purpose response to moments that exceeded the usual register. He thanked Dave for 11 years of steady employment and meant it without irony, because the hardware store had kept him, and Upright was not guaranteed years when Upright was not guaranteed, and that was worth gratitude regardless of what came after. The formal historical review of the 1,972 accident findings took 8 months. Gerald had submitted the documentation to the relevant historical racing organization in November, the week after the exhibition opened, with a formal request for review. The process was, as Dr. Marsh had predicted, not fast. It involved several parties, some of whom were reluctant for reasons that had more to do with institutional inertia than any deliberate opposition, and it required Gerald's specific combination of patience and professional pressure to keep moving forward. Logan stayed out of most of it. Gerald was better positioned to navigate those relationships, and Logan understood his own limitations well enough to know that his instinct to push hard when things moved too slowly was not always an asset in processes that ran on their own internal rhythms. He stayed in contact with Eleanor throughout. They'd developed a genuine friendship over the course of the project, the kind that forms between people who've been through something significant together and share a particular understanding of what it meant. He called her every few weeks. She'd been to the exhibition 3 times and had brought her son the 2nd time, a quiet man in his 30s who'd shaken Logan's hand and said his grandfather had been a remarkable engineer and thank you for making sure people knew it. In July, the organization issued its revised historical assessment. The document was formal and careful in the way institutional language was always formal and careful, which meant it said in more or less in words than the situation deserved. The substance was there. The original findings had not adequately weighted the documented safety scheduling failures in the context of the accident causation. Yes, intervened. Arthur Vale's engineering decisions had been a contributing factor in a complex sequence of events that included institutional failures for which he had not been responsible. The record was amended accordingly. Logan read the document twice at his kitchen table, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon in July. Then he called Eleanor. She answered and said, "I know. I just read it," before he could say anything. "How are you?" he said. "I've been sitting here for about 20 minutes, she said. "Doing much of anything." "Yeah. It doesn't change what happened to him," she said. "That he still carried it for 30 years. The record being corrected now doesn't fix what those 30 years felt like." Logan agreed, but she started again. "He was right. He told me he was right once. When I was 17, he never said it again because there was nowhere to put it and nothing to point to." Her voice shifted slightly. "Now there's somewhere to put it, even if he's not here to see it." Logan pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Put the letter in the car," Logan said. He made sure there was a record. He trusted that it would matter to someone, eventually. He trusted the car, Eleanor said. He knew it would survive. They were quiet together for a moment. The comfortable quiet of people who've been through enough together that silence doesn't need filling. Are you coming to the 1-year anniversary event at the foundation? Logan asked. Try to keep me away, she said. Owen turned 9 in September and asked for a new camera. Logan got him one, a proper one, not expensive, but a real camera with actual settings and a manual mode that Owen immediately began learning with the same methodical attention he applied to everything he cared about. He spent the next several weeks photographing everything in reach, including approximately 40 photographs of the neighborhood that Logan didn't discover until he borrowed the camera to document a vehicle for a provenance report and found Owen's archive filling the memory card. One of the photographs stopped him. It was a shot of the garage from the outside, taken from the driveway at an angle, late afternoon light coming in low. The garage door was open. You could see the workbench at the back, the tools organized on their hooks, the space heater in the corner. And you could see inside, standing over the workbench, not aware he was being photographed, looking at something with that head-tilted patient attention that was apparently visible from the outside in a way he'd never known. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Owen had taken hundreds of photographs over the past 2 years of components, of the car in various stages of restoration, of Walter with his hands on the hood, of the exhibition crowd, of Gerald with his notebook, Sienna at the kitchen table with her legal pad. Archive of this project through Owen's eyes was something Logan had thought about approaching differently, organizing properly, doing something with. He talked to Sienna about it that evening. She came over after dinner, which was still their informal pattern, not planned, not discussed, just the continuation of something that had established itself and that neither of them had moved to stop. Owen showed her his new camera and explained the manual settings with considerable enthusiasm, and she listened and asked specific questions, and then Owen went to read before bed, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table. The photographs, Logan said, and explained what he was thinking. Sienna listened. She had a specific quality of listening that he'd come to rely on, not passive, just waiting for her turn, but genuinely processing. Kind of attention that made you feel like what you were saying was landing somewhere real. Owen's photography could be part of the Foundation's educational program, she said. They're developing a component about the restoration process for school groups. An 8-year-old's perspective on the project. She paused. That's actually remarkable, Logan. It's not just cute. It's a legitimate documentation of the project from an angle nobody else had. He's going to be embarrassed, Logan said. He's going to be proud, she said. Eventually. First embarrassed, then proud. That's the standard sequence. Logan looked at his coffee. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, he'd been turning this over for a while. Not avoiding it exactly. He wasn't very good at avoiding things he'd decided needed to be said. More finding the right shape for it. When you moved in next door, he said, and you came over and looked at the car on the driveway, and I told you what I paid for it. I remember, she said, carefully. What did you actually think? She was quiet for a moment. You want the honest version. I always want the honest version. She looked at the table. I thought you were someone who couldn't afford to make bad decisions making one anyway. I thought. She stopped. I'd been trained, I think, by the world I operate in, to look at the cost of something as the primary signal of its value. And you had paid $100 for something that looked like trash. And I looked at that and I saw a struggling man doing something foolish. She paused. I didn't look at what you were actually looking at. What I was looking at, Logan said. But I didn't ask either. She met his eyes. I made up my mind before I had any information worth making it up from. The kitchen was quiet. The furnace ran its low rhythm. You asked eventually, Logan said. You wouldn't have let me help if I hadn't been honest about being wrong. Probably not. She looked at him across the table. The directness in her eyes that had sometimes felt like a wall was just her, being exactly who she was. He'd decided a long time ago. Sienna Whitmore was many things, and one of them was someone who looked at you straight on and meant what she said. I learned something, she said. From all of this. From you. She said it plainly without ceremony. I spent a long time getting good at knowing what things are worth. Financially. Strategically. I'm actually very good at it. But I had a blind spot about value that isn't measured that way, and I didn't know I had it until I watched you turn down $4 million for a principle I didn't fully understand yet. Did you understand it eventually? Logan said. Yeah, she said. I did. He looked at her. There was a lot he hadn't said across the 18 months of kitchen tables and late nights, and a project that had changed the direction of his life. He was not a person who said things easily, who put feelings into the open air without being sure of where they were going to land. Karen used to call it his decompression lag, the time between when he felt something and when he could make words out of it. I don't want you to stop coming over, he said. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't planning to. He stopped. Try it again. After the project. After there's nothing to organize or manage or work through. I still want to. He made a small sound of frustration at himself. Logan, she said. Yeah, I know what you mean. He looked at her. Okay, he said. She almost smiled. Okay, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a dramatic moment with the right music and the right light. It was two people at a kitchen table at 9:30 at night, both of them tired and imperfect and carrying everything they'd each brought to this point, looking at each other honestly. That felt right to Logan. More right than anything polished would have. The search for Arthur Vale's other two prototypes began as an obsession and became, over time, a mission. Logan had started researching it quietly, in parallel with his other work, about 6 months after the exhibition opened. The received wisdom was that prototypes 1 and 2 had been destroyed, 1 during the accident investigation process, 2 in the accident itself. The accident had been Raymond Colt's last drive in prototype 2, and the car had not been in condition to be recovered afterward. Logan had learned from this project to distrust received wisdom about destroyed things. He started with Walter. The old man was sharp, and his memory for the specific and concrete was remarkable. He might not remember what he'd had for breakfast, but he could describe the exact weld sequence on a chassis joint he'd fabricated 52 years ago with complete precision. Over a series of Saturday visits, Walter told Logan everything he remembered about what had happened to the cars after the program ended. It was not nothing. Prototype 2, Walter said, had not been destroyed immediately after the accident. There had been a period, weeks, maybe a couple of months, during which it had been stored while the investigation was ongoing. What happened after that? Walter didn't know. But it hadn't been destroyed before the investigation was complete, because he'd seen it himself in storage, still identifiable, still largely intact. Who had custody of it during that period? Logan asked. Walter thought. Creston owned everything. His facility, his vehicles. After the program closed, everything would have gone through his estate operation, eventually. Did Creston have other properties? Storage facilities? He had a farm, Walter said, out past Millard County. Big piece of property. He'd use the outbuildings for overflow storage sometimes. Logan drove out to Millard County on a Tuesday in March. The farm had passed through 3 owners since the Creston estate sold it in 1981. The current owner was a man in his 60s named Boyd, who farmed it primarily and used the outbuildings for equipment storage. He was skeptical and slightly suspicious, yet when Logan explained what he was looking for, which was a completely reasonable response to a stranger showing up and asking about something from 50 years ago. Logan showed him the foundation documentation. He explained the project and the exhibition. He was patient and honest and didn't push. Boyd took him to the outbuildings. In the third one, under 4 decades of accumulated farm equipment and storage material, was something with a tarp over it. Logan lifted the tarp. The condition was terrible. Worse than Prototype 3 had been the accident damage was still present, and 50 years of exposure to an agricultural storage environment had done significant additional harm. But the chassis markings were legible, and the geometry that Logan now knew how to read from 18 months of learning the specific vocabulary of Arthur Vale's engineering decisions was unmistakable. AV2. He stood in the outbuilding in the March cold, looking at it, and felt something that was complicated enough that he didn't try to name it immediately. He called Gerald from the parking lot. I found 2, he said. Gerald said something that Logan was fairly sure was a word Gerald didn't use very often. It's in bad shape, Logan said. Much worse than 3. The accident damage is still there, but it's salvageable partially, maybe significantly with the approach. What do you want to do? Gerald said. Logan looked at the outbuilding. What do you think Vale would want? He said. A pause. I think, Gerald said carefully, that a man who hid a letter in a sealed Folsom compartment hoping someone would eventually find it and understand was not a man who would want what could be saved to be left in a barn. Yeah, Logan said. That's what I think too. The search for Prototype 1 took 18 more months. It was harder. One had more thoroughly disappeared into the secondary market, passing through at least 4 private hands over the decades with incomplete documentation each time, the kind of provenance chain that made authentication difficult and acquisition complicated. Logan worked it the same way. He worked everything, patiently, methodically, following the thread wherever it led without assuming he knew where it was going. He found it through a detail in one of Arthur Vale's engineering notebooks, a specific modification Vale had noted making to Prototype 1's cooling system in 1970, distinctive change that he could identify if he ever had the car in front of him. A collector in Pennsylvania had a vehicle in his collection that his estate documentation described vaguely as an American sports racer of uncertain manufacture, circa 1960s. The collector had died, his estate was being liquidated, and the vehicle was one of several being assessed. Logan drove to Pennsylvania on a Thursday. He found the modification on the cooling system exactly where the notebook said it would be, AV1. He sat on the floor of the estate's storage barn for a while after that, just because his legs needed a moment. 2 years of searching, and there it was. He took out his phone and called Eleanor. I found it, he said. I found one. She made a sound on the other end of the phone that he'd never heard from her before, not the careful steadiness, not the controlled gratitude. Something rawer, something that came from a place too deep for management. All 3, she said. You found all 3? All 3, he said. He looked at the car in front of him. 50 years in a barn, mislabeled in an estate document, unknown to the world that had thought it was gone. Gone, just waiting. The reunion exhibition opened 3 years after Logan had first lifted a tarp in a salvage yard. All 3 Vale prototypes, together, purpose-designed space that the Whitfield Foundation had built with contributions that included a substantial one from Victor Langford, attended the opening and stood in front of the assembled cars for a long time before he found Logan in the crowd. You did the impossible, Langford said. I did the possible, slowly, Logan said. There's a difference. Langford looked at him for a moment. He said, There isn't. Not from where I'm standing. Logan didn't argue the point. The crowd at the opening was larger than the first exhibition. Eleanor was there. With her son and her son's family, there were grandchildren now, Vale's great-grandchildren, who ran their hands along the cars with the uncomplicated wonder of children who had not yet learned to be careful about showing what moved them. Walter came in a wheelchair this time, pushed by his granddaughter. He was 81. He'd had a fall in the winter and his mobility had been limited since, but he'd been absolutely clear to everyone who suggested he watch via live stream that he would be in person, and that was the end of the conversation. Logan pushed the wheelchair to the front of the assembled cars when the crowd opened space. Walter looked at all 3 together there, the first time any living person had seen them in the same room since 1972. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, he'd have complained about the lighting in here. Logan laughed, genuinely. Yeah? He always thought display lighting washed out the bodywork, Walter said. He was particular about that. He reached out and rested his hand on the fender of Prototype 3, the car Logan had bought for $100. But he'd have been proud, in his way. He wouldn't have said so directly. But you'd have known. Logan crouched down beside the wheelchair. Did you ever tell him, he said, when you saw him after? Did you ever tell him that the work was worth it? Walter was quiet. We didn't talk about it, he said. Neither of us knew how to start. He looked at his hand on the fender. I regret that. He kept your name in the notebooks, Logan said. He wrote about your fabrication instinct specifically. He valued you. Walter's hand was still on the metal. He said, I just wish I'd said it when he was alive to hear it. Logan stayed beside him for a moment. That was the thing about this whole project that couldn't be fixed, restored, or corrected by any amount of work. The years that had passed, the words that hadn't been said, the space between what people felt and what they managed to express while there was still time. Amount of archival work changed that. No exhibition changed it. You found what you could find, and you did what you could do, and some of it came too late, and you carried that alongside the rest of it. That was honest, and honesty, Logan had decided, was worth more than comfort. Owen was 11 when the reunion exhibition opened. He'd spent the morning photographing everything: the setup, the crowds, the cars, Walt in his wheelchair, Eleanor with her great-grandchildren, Langford standing alone in front of Prototype 1, looking at something Logan couldn't read from across the room. The photographs were good. They'd been getting good for a while now. The Foundation had used 3 of Owen's images in their educational materials, which Owen had been matter-of-fact about, in the way kids were matter-of-fact about things that privately thrilled them. After the formal part of the opening was done, after the speeches and the crowds, and the specific organized chaos of an event Sienna had spent 2 months building, Logan found Owen sitting on a bench in front of the 3 cars with his camera in his lap, not photographing, just looking. Logan sat down beside him. They looked at the cars together for a while without saying anything. The space had quieted somewhat. Most of the crowd had moved on to other parts of the exhibition, and it was just the 2 of them, and the 3 cars, and the low, careful hum of the climate control, and the particular quality of light that made the deep blue look like something that existed at a depth. "Dad," Owen said, "Yeah. Do you think we'll find other ones? Other cars that nobody knows about?" "Probably," Logan said. "There are more out there. There always are." Owen thought about this. Because people lose track of things, and because things get buried, and because sometimes something built really well just outlasts all the reasons it wasn't supposed to. Owen looked at Prototype 3, the $100 car, the beginning of everything. "I remember when you brought it home," he said. "You said it looked like it had been in a war." "Several, maybe," Owenson said, repeating the old exchange with the casual ease of something that had become part of their shared language. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know it would be this big." "Neither did I. Are you glad you did it?" Logan looked at the 3 cars. He looked at the archival wall, where Arthur Vale's photograph hung alongside the full documentation of his engineering work and the corrected historical record and the letter from the sealed compartment. He looked at where Eleanor was standing across the room with her great-grandchildren, 2 small kids examining the wheel arch of Prototype 1 with their noses about 6 inches from the metal. He thought about the hardware store, the space heater cycling on and off. Mortgage intervened, the mortgage on the 15th. The nights when the project had been hard enough that he sat in the shop alone and had to think carefully about whether he was making a mistake. He thought about Karen, who would have had very sharp opinions about all of it and would have been right. He said, "I'm glad." Owen leaned against his arm briefly, the easy, unself-conscious contact of a kid who hadn't yet learned to be awkward about it. Then he straightened up and lifted the camera and took a photograph of the 3 cars together, the way they were supposed to be, the way Arthur Vale had never gotten to see. Sienna came and sat on Logan's other side. She didn't say anything either. She was a person who'd learned, over the course of something neither of them had planned, that silence between people who knew each other well was not empty. She'd come a long way from the woman who'd stood at a property line with her arms crossed, filling the silence with certainty about things she hadn't examined carefully enough. They all 3 sat together in front of the cars. A man had built 3 things with his hands and his mind and his specific, patient understanding of how metal behaved and what it could be made to do. The world had tried to erase all of it through accident and economics and institutional convenience, and 50 years of simple neglect. Yes, he had not quite managed it. The things built well enough and carefully enough had held their shape through everything, waiting for someone to look at them with the right kind of attention. Logan thought about what Walter had said. "I just wish I'd said it when he was alive to hear it." He understood that. He understood it completely, and he carried it because it was true and because some truths were worth carrying as a reminder of what not to wait on. He turned to Sienna. She was already looking at him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. All of it." She held his gaze. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I got more out of this than you know." "I think I know," he said. She looked at the cars. Something in her expression was quiet and clear and entirely unguarded. The expression of a person who has put down something heavy and is standing straight for the first time in a while. "I used to think," I was good at knowing what things were worth, she said. I'm better at it now, she said. You fixed a gap in my education. Logan looked at the $100 car, shining blue and exact and entirely itself in the careful light. He thought about driving past Hendrick's salvage that first October morning, about the way the feeling had stopped him before his brain had the words for it. About $100 he couldn't really afford, and a torn tarp and something extraordinary underneath waiting. He had believed he was saving a car. He had not understood yet that the car was also going to save him, was going to give him a direction and a purpose and a way of being in the world that fit him the way the right tool fit the right job, which was the only kind of fitting he'd ever really trusted. He had not understood that a 7-year-old with sticky notes and a point-and-shoot camera was going to turn into a kid who saw the world through a lens and documented things that mattered before they could be lost. He had not understood that a billionaire neighbor who had laughed at him in his driveway was going to become someone he needed, genuinely needed, in all the ways that counted. Of it had been visible at first glance. That was the thing. The lesson, if there was one, and Logan was suspicious of lessons that tied up too neatly, because life and his experience did not do that. But if there was something true in all of it, it was this: that worth and value, and the real quality of things were almost never visible at first glance. That the rust was not the truth, that what something looked like when it was buried and damaged and written off by the people who should have known better was not what it was. You had to look carefully. You had to be willing to lift the tarp. The 3 cars were there, complete, documented, restored to the best that good work and honest effort could achieve. Perfect, Logan still didn't trust. Perfect but real and present and saved from the particular erasure of being forgotten. Arthur Vale had hoped, across 50 years in a salvage yard and $100, and everything that had followed, someone had finally made that worth it. The afternoon light moved in the exhibition space, and Owen took another photograph, and the deep blue held its color, and Logan Mercer sat between his son and the woman who had learned to see what he saw, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the hard years had been building toward something after all, because hard years always did. Just because this time someone had looked carefully enough to find it.